Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Red River War, Last Stand on the Plains, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Prelude to War. The Red River War of 1874-75 was the culmination of decades of conflict between the United States government and the Plains Indians, who had long resisted efforts to be confined to reservations and forced to adopt European American ways of life. In this chapter, we will explore the events that led up to the outbreak of hostilities between the U.S. Army and the Plains Indians, examining the complex social, economic, and political factors that fueled the conflict. For centuries before European contact, the Great Plains of North America were home to a diverse array of indigenous cultures, each with their own unique languages, beliefs, and ways of life. The arrival of Europeans in the 16th century, however, brought with it new diseases, technologies, and political systems that would have a profound impact on the Plains tribes. By the mid-19th century, the Plains Indians had come into increasing contact with American traders, settlers, and military forces. This contact was not always peaceful, as the two groups clashed over land, resources, and cultural differences. In response to this conflict, the U.S. government began to implement a policy of Indian removal, which sought to relocate indigenous peoples to reservations where they could be monitored and controlled. The reservation system was a deeply flawed solution to the problem of Indian-white relations. For one, the land set aside for reservations was often of poor quality, unsuitable for agriculture or hunting. Additionally, the Indian agents who were responsible for overseeing the reservations were often corrupt, stealing resources meant for the tribes and using them for their own personal gain. These issues were compounded by the fact that the Plains Indians had a fundamentally different understanding of land ownership than did Europeans. For the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, land was not something that could be owned or bought and sold. Rather, it was a communal resource to be shared among all members of the tribe. The reservation system, which sought to confine Indians to specific tracts of land, therefore represented a fundamental challenge to their way of life. The tensions between the Plains Indians and the U.S. government came to a head in the 1860s and 1870s, as westward expansion and the growing demand for resources such as gold and timber put increasing pressure on Indian lands. The government responded with a series of treaties that sought to reduce the size of Indian territories and place them under federal control. These treaties were often signed under duress, as Plains tribes faced the threat of military force if they did not comply with the government's demands. Additionally, the U.S. government frequently failed to uphold its side of the bargain, neglecting to provide promised food, supplies, and other resources to the reservations. All of these factors contributed to a growing sense of frustration and anger among the Plains Indians, who felt that their way of life was under attack. As the situation grew more tense, some members of the tribes began to take matters into their own hands, raiding settlements and attacking military outposts in acts of resistance. It was in this context that the Red River War broke out in 1874. The conflict would be bloody and brutal, with both sides suffering significant casualties. However, it was also a product of a longer history of conflict and misunderstanding between the U.S. government and the Plains Indians. In the following chapters, we will explore the specific events of the Red River War in greater detail, examining the strategies, tactics, and consequences of this pivotal moment in American history. Chapter 2, Battle of Adobe Walls. The Battle of Adobe Walls was the first major engagement of the Red River War, and it would set the tone for the conflict to come. In this chapter, we will examine the events leading up to the battle, the reasons behind the attack, and the consequences of the fighting for both sides. In the spring of 1874, a group of buffalo hunters and traders had set up camp at Adobe Walls, an abandoned trading post located in what is now the Texas Panhandle. The camp was home to around 28 men, many of them experienced frontiersmen who had come west in search of adventure and fortune. The camp at Adobe Walls was not popular with the local Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne tribes, who saw the presence of the buffalo hunters as a threat to their way of life. These tribes had long relied on the buffalo for food, clothing, and shelter, and the arrival of white hunters had caused the herds to dwindle. Additionally, the hunters had been known to sell weapons and ammunition to the Plains tribes, a fact that made them even more suspicious. On June 27, 1874, a group of several hundred Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne warriors launched a surprise attack on the camp at Adobe Walls. The hunters had been warned of the possible danger by a group of friendly Indians, but many had dismissed the threat as exaggerated. The initial assault was unsuccessful, as the hunters were able to fend off the attackers with their superior firepower. However, the Indians regrouped and launched a second, more sustained attack that lasted for several days. The hunters were eventually forced to abandon the camp and flee to safety. The Battle of Adobe Walls was a significant event in the early stages of the Red River War. It marked a clear escalation of hostilities between the Plains Indians and the U.S. Army, and it demonstrated the determination of the Indian nations to resist the encroachment of white settlers and hunters. For the Plains tribes, the battle was a strategic victory, as it forced the buffalo hunters to abandon one of their key camps and retreat to areas that were more heavily guarded. It also showed that the Indians were capable of launching coordinated attacks and inflicting serious damage on their enemies. For the hunters and traders, the battle was a wake-up call. Many of them had believed that their superior firepower and knowledge of the terrain would protect them from attack, but the events at Adobe Walls showed that they were not invincible. The battle also served as a rallying cry for the U.S. Army, which now saw the need for a more aggressive response to the Plains Indians. In the following months, the conflict would escalate further, as both sides sought to gain the upper hand in a brutal and bloody war. The Battle of Adobe Walls, while just one episode in this larger conflict, would remain a significant moment in the history of the American West, reminding us of the complex and often violent interactions between different cultures and peoples. Chapter 3: Sheridan's Campaign. In the summer of 1874, General Philip Sheridan was sent to the Great Plains to take command of the U.S. Army's efforts to subdue the Plains Indians. In this chapter, we will examine the tactics used by Sheridan and his troops, and the impact of these strategies on the Indian nations. Sheridan was a veteran of the Civil War, where he had earned a reputation as a skilled and aggressive commander. He brought this same approach to the conflict on the Great Plains, where he believed that a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure could bring the Indians to heel. One of the key tactics used by Sheridan was the creation of a network of military outposts and supply lines that allowed the Army to operate more effectively in Indian territory. These outposts were often built in strategic locations, such as near water sources or at key intersections of Indian trade routes. Sheridan also recognized the importance of intelligence gathering in the conflict. He employed a network of scouts and spies, many of whom were former Indian fighters themselves, to gather information on the movements and intentions of the Plains tribes. This information was crucial in allowing the Army to plan its campaigns more effectively and avoid surprise attacks. Another important aspect of Sheridan's strategy was the use of new weapons and tactics. The Army began to equip its soldiers with repeating rifles, which could fire multiple shots without the need for reloading. This gave the soldiers a significant advantage over the Plains Indians, who were still using older, single-shot weapons. Sheridan also pioneered the use of total war tactics on the Great Plains, which sought to destroy the Indians' ability to wage war by targeting their food sources, horses, and other resources. This strategy involved burning Indian villages, slaughtering their livestock, and poisoning their water sources. The impact of Sheridan's campaign was significant. By the end of 1874, the Army had destroyed several key Indian villages and killed or captured many of their warriors. The Plains tribes were forced to retreat further west, away from the areas of white settlement and into more hostile territory. However, Sheridan's tactics also had a devastating impact on the Indian nations. The destruction of villages and the slaughter of livestock and horses left many tribes without the means to support themselves. The use of scorched earth tactics also created a legacy of bitterness and resentment that would last for generations. In the end, Sheridan's campaign was only one part of a larger conflict that would drag on for years. However, his tactics and strategies would set the tone for the Army's approach to the Plains Indians, and would shape the way that the conflict was remembered in the years to come. Chapter 4: The Winter Campaign. The winter of 1874-75 was a turning point in the Red River War. In this chapter, we will examine the Army's campaigns during this period and the impact of the brutal winter conditions on both sides. The winter of 1874-75 was one of the harshest on record in the Great Plains. Temperatures dropped to well below freezing, and snow and ice made travel difficult and dangerous. For the Plains Indians, who were accustomed to living off the land, the winter was an especially challenging time. Many tribes were forced to rely on government rations to survive, which were often insufficient or unreliable. Despite the difficult conditions, the U.S. Army launched a series of campaigns against the Plains Indians during the winter months. One of the key objectives of these campaigns was to destroy Indian villages and settlements, which were often clustered near sources of water and shelter. The Army's campaigns during the winter of 1874-75 were marked by the same aggressive tactics used in the earlier stages of the conflict. Soldiers burned villages, destroyed food stores, and killed or captured many Indian warriors. In some cases, women and children were also taken prisoner. For the Plains Indians, the winter campaigns were a disaster. Many tribes suffered significant losses, both in terms of people and resources. The destruction of villages and the loss of food and horses left many tribes struggling to survive and forced them to move further west in search of new resources. Despite the success of the winter campaigns, the Army also faced significant challenges during this period. The harsh winter conditions made travel and communication difficult, and many soldiers suffered from frostbite, illness, and other ailments. Supplies were often limited, and the soldiers were forced to live off the land, just as the Indians were. The winter campaigns of 1874-75 marked a critical turning point in the Red River War. While the Army was able to inflict significant damage on the Plains Indians, the harsh winter conditions and the difficulties of campaigning in such an environment would also take a toll on the soldiers. Additionally, the long-term impact of the destruction of Indian villages and the loss of resources would create a legacy of bitterness and resentment that would last for generations. Chapter 5: Aftermath and Legacy. The Red River War was a defining moment in the history of the American West. In this chapter, we will examine the aftermath of the conflict and its long-term impact on the Plains Indians and the United States as a whole. The immediate aftermath of the Red River War was marked by a sense of triumph for the U.S. Army. The Indian nations had been forced to retreat further west, away from the areas of white settlement, and the Army had demonstrated its ability to project force across the Great Plains. However, the victory was also a costly one, with both sides suffering significant losses. For the Plains Indians, the Red River War represented a significant setback. Many tribes had lost large numbers of warriors, and their ability to resist the encroachment of white settlers and hunters had been significantly weakened. The destruction of villages and the loss of resources had left many tribes struggling to survive, and the forced relocation to reservations represented a profound challenge to their way of life. The impact of the Red River War on the United States was also significant. The conflict demonstrated the government's willingness to use military force to achieve its objectives, and it set the stage for future conflicts with the Plains Indians. It also solidified the idea of westward expansion as a central tenet of American identity, and helped to create the myth of the American West as a place of rugged individualism and adventure. However, the legacy of the Red River War was not entirely positive. The conflict had caused significant loss of life and suffering on both sides, and it had created a lasting legacy of bitterness and resentment. The forced relocation of the Plains Indians to reservations would lead to further conflicts and injustices in the years to come, including the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Today, the Red River War is remembered as a complex and often tragic episode in American history. It serves as a reminder of the violence and injustice that characterized the settlement of the American West, as well as the resilience and courage of the Plains Indians in the face of overwhelming odds. By understanding the legacy of the Red River War, we can gain a deeper appreciation of the complex history of the American West and the ongoing struggles for justice and equality that continue to shape our society today. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. so you don't miss out on our next video.